The family estate had always carried an air of whispered secrets, an atmosphere heavy with the weight of history. Its walls, lined with fading portraits of ancestors, seemed almost alive, watching every movement, every whispered conversation. Generations had lived and died within these confines, each one bound to a strict, unyielding devotion to preserving the purity of their bloodline. No outsiders were allowed, no unions unplanned or unapproved. From the very beginning, the Aisha family had placed their obsession with lineage above everything else, and the consequences of that obsession were hidden behind closed doors, only half understood even by those who lived it. Eleanor, the youngest in the latest generation, had grown up in this suffocating environment, shielded from the world outside by heavy gates, sprawling hedges, and a labyrinth of rules that dictated every part of her existence. She had been told stories of her ancestors, men and women who had accomplished great feats, who had built empires of wealth and influence, but the shadows of their private lives were never spoken aloud. There were hints, fleeting and uncomfortable, of the strange illnesses, the odd deformities, and the unusual behaviors that had plagued certain branches of the family. Yet Eleanor had been raised to believe these were minor anomalies, nothing more than peculiar quirks of blood, unworthy of thought or attention. The truth was far more sinister. For centuries, the family had married within itself, generations upon generations bound by contracts, promises, and the relentless insistence on keeping the bloodline untainted by outsiders. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. The family tree, if one could call it that, was a tangle of branches that looped back upon themselves, creating twisted patterns that no outside genealogist could ever untangle. To anyone looking in from the outside, this might have seemed like devotion to tradition. To those within, it was survival, obsession, and ultimately, a prison. Eleanor, now in her early 20s, had spent most of her life walking these corridors of secrecy. She knew the family rules better than she knew the outside world. She had learned to navigate the invisible boundaries, to avoid the unspoken dangers of curiosity, and to endure the quiet, suffocating gaze of her relatives. And yet, despite every precaution, life had a way of spiraling into the unexpected. It began with subtle changes she could hardly explain, a fatigue that clung to her like a shadow, a nausea that appeared without warning, and dreams filled with faces that seemed impossibly familiar yet impossible to place. At first, she dismissed them, blaming the heavy diet of solitude and stress that had defined her life. But soon, the signs became undeniable. Eleanor was pregnant. The revelation sent a shiver through the household, a quiet, electric fear that moved through the walls like a living thing. Nobody had anticipated it, Eleanor herself included. In a family so tightly controlled, where every union was monitored and every relationship carefully arranged, the idea that a child could be conceived without knowledge or consent was unthinkable. Questions hung in the air, unspoken, yet heavy. How had this happened? Who could possibly be responsible? Eleanor tried to answer these questions herself, scouring her memory for any encounter, any lapse in oversight that might explain the impossible. She remembered nothing, not a single moment that could account for the conception. The more she thought, the more the reality of her situation became a terrifying mystery. It was as though the child growing within her was a force unto itself, a living embodiment of everything the family had sought to control for generations, yet now entirely beyond their grasp. The household, once a place of order and predictability, began to shift. Small signs appeared, odd looks, hushed conversations in corners, an increase in whispered warnings whenever Eleanor entered a room. The servants, the distant cousins, even the elder matriarchs who rarely left their chambers, seemed to sense that something extraordinary, something dangerous, had taken root within the house. And indeed, it was extraordinary. Eleanor could feel it in the way the child moved, subtle yet insistent, as though aware of the walls and the eyes that surrounded it. As weeks passed, Eleanor found herself trapped between two worlds: the life she had always known within the estate and the inexplicable reality of the life growing inside her. Each day brought new anxieties, a creeping dread that whispered of the unknown. The family's obsession with lineage, purity, and secrecy had prepared her for everything, except this. The child was a challenge to everything the family believed, a question that could not be answered, a truth that could not be hidden. And so, in the dimly lit corridors of the old estate, Eleanor's story began, not with understanding, not with preparation, but with a quiet, relentless uncertainty. She carried within her a child no one could explain, a living testament to generations of choices, mistakes, and secrets. It was a beginning, but the path ahead was shrouded in shadows, and every step would reveal more of the darkness that had been carefully buried for centuries. The estate seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the moment when the impossible would be revealed, when the child's existence would force the family to confront the tangled web of blood and obsession that had defined them for centuries. Eleanor did not yet know what the child would look like, what secrets it might carry, or what the consequences would be. But one thing was certain: nothing in the family's carefully controlled world would ever be the same again. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor's pregnancy advanced with an almost unnatural speed. Each morning she awoke to new sensations, subtle yet unsettling, as though the child within her had a mind of its own. The household watched silently, their eyes heavy with suspicion, judgment, and a strange, morbid curiosity. Whispers followed her through the corridors, half-formed questions, theories, and accusations that were never spoken aloud, but carried a weight heavier than words. The very air seemed charged with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were aware of the extraordinary event unfolding in their midst. Eleanor had always felt isolated, but now isolation took on a new dimension. She moved through the estate like a ghost, observed by those who had once seemed distant, but now seemed intensely focused on her every gesture, every change in appearance. She noticed the furtive glances of her cousins, the subtle shifts in expression. Among the servants, the rigid posture of the matriarchs whenever she entered a room. Every encounter felt like an examination, every conversation a test she could not pass. Yet no one dared confront her directly. The family's obsession with appearances prevented open dialogue. The child's growth was unlike anything Eleanor had read about or imagined. She experienced sharp jolts of movement at odd hours, bursts of energy that seemed disproportionate to the stage of her pregnancy. Her body changed in ways that defied normal expectations, her face sometimes reflecting expressions she did not feel, her eyes flickering with unexplainable intensity. At night, when the house fell silent, she could hear what she thought was the child's voice, a faint whisper, almost human, almost conscious, calling to her in the darkness. She tried to dismiss it as imagination, the result of stress and isolation, but the sensation was undeniable. The midwife, an elderly woman who had served the family for decades, became a quiet confidant, though she too was unnerved by the pregnancy. She had seen many unusual births, but nothing like this. During her discreet visits, she murmured cautions and warnings, her eyes betraying fear beneath her composed exterior. "Some children," she said one evening, leaning close to Eleanor's ear, "carry the weight of all that came before them. They are not like ordinary babies. They are a question to the world, and sometimes a curse." Eleanor did not respond, but the words echoed in her mind, a haunting premonition of what was to come. The village beyond the estate gates began to notice subtle changes as well. Eleanor's absence from normal social interactions was explained with careful lies, but rumors spread regardless. Villagers spoke of the strange behaviors of the family, of the inescapable, oppressive atmosphere within the estate. Stories emerged of deformities, sudden illnesses, and mental instability among those who had been born from generations of internal unions. Some whispered that the family's obsession with bloodlines had created something unnatural, a living echo of their own vanity and fear. Eleanor herself did not yet understand the truth of these warnings, but she could feel the pressure building, the weight of generations pressing down upon her shoulders and upon the life growing within her. As her pregnancy progressed, Eleanor began to notice changes in herself beyond the physical. She experienced moments of clarity so intense that they frightened her, sudden surges of emotion and understanding that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her own mind. She would stare at the portraits on the walls, seeing in them not only the faces of her ancestors, but the echoes of their desires, obsessions, and mistakes. It was as if the child she carried was drawing knowledge, memory, and essence from the generations that had come before, creating a bridge between past and future that terrified and fascinated her in equal measure. The family's reaction grew more strained with each passing day. Her mother, a stern woman whose loyalty to tradition was unquestioned, avoided Eleanor's gaze entirely, retreating into her chambers to pray, meditate, and mutter incantations, meant to protect the family from what she could not comprehend. Her father, a man who had long believed in controlling every aspect of his household, became increasingly irritable, his temper short, his patience fraying as the impossible reality of Eleanor's condition sank in. Even her siblings, who had once treated her with indifference or rivalry, now watched her with a mix of awe and fear, unsure whether to celebrate the miracle or fear the curse. Eleanor herself oscillated between terror and awe. She could not deny that the child inside her was unlike any life she had encountered, but she also could not predict what it would become. In the quiet moments, she imagined its face, its eyes, its tiny hands, and shivered at the intensity of the connection she felt. It was as though the child existed not only within her womb, but in some hidden dimension of her family's history, a living testament to the consequences of centuries of obsession. And still no one could explain it. Not the midwife, not her family, not the whispered theories circulating among the villagers. The child was a riddle, a living question, an embodiment of everything the family had attempted to hide, deny, or control. Eleanor felt the tension in the house grow unbearable, a pressure that seemed to intensify with every heartbeat, every kick, every impossible movement of the child within her. The estate itself seemed to respond to the pregnancy. Doors would creak without cause, shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, and faint whispers, neither human nor animal, echoed through the corridors at night. It was as if the house, steeped in centuries of secrecy and bloodline obsession, recognized the arrival of something that might undo all it had preserved. Eleanor could feel it, a presence pressing against her from every corner, urging her toward a destiny she neither wanted nor understood. By the end of the second month, the family could no longer ignore the impossibility of the situation. Whispers had turned to conjecture, conjecture to fear, and fear to a palpable tension that hung over every meal, every conversation, every glance. Eleanor walked among them like a living storm, the silent eye of a hurricane that had yet to reveal its power, and though none would speak it aloud, all knew that the child she carried was no ordinary child. Its very existence challenged the rules, the lineage, and the careful control that had defined the family for centuries. The estate had become a place of tension so thick it could be felt in the air. Every step Eleanor took seemed amplified. Every whisper behind closed doors grew louder in her mind. She began noticing patterns she had never perceived before. The servants' nervous glances when she entered a room, the subtle avoidance of eye contact from her cousins, and the carefully orchestrated silences during family meals. It was as if the entire household had become a stage, with Eleanor as the central character in a drama that none dared name aloud. Rumors began to circulate beyond the walls of the estate. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of the impossible pregnancy, each retelling more exaggerated than the last. Some claimed they had seen Eleanor wandering at odd hours, her figure illuminated by moonlight, speaking softly to herself or to the child she carried. Others whispered of shadows that moved unnaturally behind her, of objects that shifted without cause when she passed by. The stories spread, growing with each telling, until fear and fascination merged into a single, palpable force. Within the family, the whispers were no longer subtle. They became pointed glances, furtive comments in corners, and the occasional outright confrontation, though always carefully framed in concern or tradition. Eleanor's mother, once composed and authoritative, now trembled when speaking of the pregnancy. "You must guard yourself," she said one morning, her voice tight with unspoken dread. "Not for you, but for what is coming. You do not yet understand what this child is. Perhaps no one ever will." Eleanor wanted to protest, to demand an explanation, but she found herself unable to speak. The words would not come. The gravity of her situation was too vast, too incomprehensible. Her siblings oscillated between fear and fascination. Some tried to maintain normalcy, hoping the pregnancy would follow the expected course, that the child would be born without incident, and life would return to its familiar rhythm. Others, more perceptive, or perhaps more aware of the family's cursed history, watched Eleanor with a growing sense of dread. They noticed the intensity of her connection to the child, the way she would speak softly to it, as though it could understand her words. And sometimes, when the room was quiet, they could almost hear the faint echo of a voice responding, though it belonged to no one present. Eleanor herself was both terrified and entranced. She felt the child's presence not only in her body, but in her mind, in her very soul. At night, she would lie awake listening to her own heartbeat and the rhythmic movement of the child within her. She imagined its face, its hands, and the impossible combination of traits it might inherit from generations of tightly bound ancestors. She wondered what it would look like, how it would think, and whether it would embody the best or worst of the lineage she carried. The questions swirled endlessly in her mind, each answer more elusive than the last. The midwife continued her discreet visits, but her reassurances were thin and unconvincing. "Some children," she said quietly, leaning close to Eleanor's ear one evening, "are born carrying the weight of generations. They are not merely children, they are living mirrors of all that has come before. And sometimes, they are too much for the world to bear." Eleanor shivered, the words reverberating through her chest. She did not know whether to hope or despair, to fear or accept. All she knew was that the child growing inside her was extraordinary, in ways she could barely comprehend. Strange occurrences began to escalate. Doors creaked open on their own, shadows shifted in impossible ways, and objects seemed to move when no one was near. The servants whispered of cold drafts, faint voices, and glimpses of figures in the corners of rooms that vanished when approached. Eleanor could not deny it. Something unusual, something beyond ordinary human understanding, was at play. It was as though the child's presence had altered the very nature of the estate, awakening forces that had lain dormant for generations. The family's history of inbreeding, once carefully hidden, began to surface in subtle but undeniable ways. Old journals, forbidden letters, and faded photographs revealed a pattern of obsession, secrecy, and an almost ritualistic dedication to bloodlines. Eleanor pored over these remnants in stolen moments, piecing together a legacy of twisted unions, tragic illnesses, and unexplained deformities. She realized that her own pregnancy was a continuation of this dark pattern, a living embodiment of choices made centuries ago, a question that no one could answer. Fear and fascination coexisted in the household, a fragile balance that threatened to shatter at any moment. The family elders, who had long believed themselves in control of their legacy, now found themselves powerless. They had attempted to dominate the natural order, to preserve the purity of their line, and yet here was Eleanor, defying explanation, carrying a child that challenged every assumption, every rule, every carefully constructed hierarchy. Eleanor felt the weight of this knowledge pressing down upon her. She could sense the expectations, the anxieties, the unspoken fears of those around her, and she began to understand that her own destiny and the destiny of the child were intertwined with the family's dark history. There was no turning back, no hiding, no escape. The child would arrive, and with it would come revelations that could not be ignored, secrets that could not remain buried, and consequences that would ripple through the family for generations to come. As the weeks progressed, Eleanor's world contracted to the space within the estate, to the rhythm of her body, and to the constant presence of the child. Outside, the villagers whispered, speculated, and feared, while inside, the family braced for a reality they could neither control nor fully comprehend. Eleanor herself oscillated between awe and terror, love and dread, hope and despair. She knew that the child growing inside her was unlike any other, a living question mark that would challenge everything they had ever believed. and in the quiet moments of the night, when the house seemed to hold its breath, she felt the child stir, and she knew that the time of revelation was drawing near. The day arrived with a sense of inevitability, a silent tension that gripped every corner of the estate. Eleanor awoke before dawn, her body taut with anticipation and pain, every nerve heightened, as though the very walls of the house were attuned to the approaching moment. She felt the child moving insistently, almost urgently, as if it sensed the eyes and expectations that would soon bear witness to its arrival. The midwife arrived with a quiet urgency, her face pale and lined with worry, her hands steady despite the tremor that Eleanor could feel radiating from her. The birth began with a rhythm that seemed both natural and unnatural, a cadence that echoed through the house like a chant. Eleanor's cries mingled with the soft instructions of the midwife, but even in the midst of labor, there was a sense that this birth was unlike any other the woman had attended. The child's movements were forceful, deliberate, and yet precise, as if it knew the path it was taking before it even emerged. Eleanor felt a mixture of fear and awe, a realization that she was participating in something extraordinary, something that defied the ordinary rules of life. Hours passed, each one stretching with agonizing intensity, until finally, with a sharp, definitive cry, the child was born. A hush fell over the room, broken only by Eleanor's trembling voice and the child's first piercing wail. The midwife, her hands steady but her heart racing, wrapped the newborn in cloth and placed it gently on Eleanor's chest. And in that moment, all who were present were struck silent, caught between disbelief and shock. The child was unlike anything they had ever seen. Its features were both familiar and alien, a complex tapestry woven from generations of tightly bound lineage. The eyes, large and unnervingly perceptive, seemed to hold knowledge far beyond its months of existence. The skin bore subtle traces of unusual pigmentation, patterns that mirrored ancient family traits yet had never appeared in living memory. The body, though fragile in some ways, displayed a curious strength, a resilience that defied the expectations of both genetics and nature. Every detail, from the shape of the hands to the curve of the spine, carried echoes of ancestors long gone, yet the combination was wholly unprecedented, wholly inexplicable. Eleanor, trembling with a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and awe, gazed down at the child. She could feel a connection that went beyond the physical, a bridge linking her consciousness to that of the newborn. The child's eyes met hers, and in that instant, it was as if she glimpsed the entire history of her family, the triumphs and the mistakes, the secrets and the obsessions, all compressed into the presence of this single, extraordinary being. She shivered, unsure whether to rejoice or recoil from the weight of what had been born. The family gathered cautiously, drawn to the birth by a mixture of duty, fear, and morbid curiosity. Their faces reflected the impossible complexity of the child, awe, suspicion, terror, and fascination all intertwined. Whispers began almost immediately, as relatives struggled to articulate what they saw. Some claimed to detect familiar traits from distant ancestors. Others insisted that certain features were impossible, unnatural. The midwife, usually calm and resolute, found herself whispering reassurances that she did not entirely believe. "It is alive," she murmured, her voice trembling. "It is strong. It will survive. But what it carries is beyond our understanding." As the hours passed, Eleanor began to notice more extraordinary details. The child's cries were oddly melodic, carrying subtle variations in tone that seemed almost like language. Its small hands moved with an uncanny precision, grasping objects and reacting to stimuli in ways that seemed far beyond its developmental stage. The midwife took meticulous notes, but even she could not explain the rapidity of the child's growth and responsiveness. Something about this newborn defied the rules of biology, genetics, and human expectation. Outside the room, the household reacted with escalating intensity. The servants whispered of omens and curses, of unnatural forces awakened within the estate. Cousins and siblings, previously distant or indifferent, now hovered in anxious anticipation, their fear mingling with awe. Even the elders, who had long prided themselves on controlling every aspect of the family's legacy, seemed powerless before the reality of the child. Their authority, their knowledge, their understanding of heredity, all were called into question by the extraordinary being before them. Eleanor herself felt the weight of the moment in every fiber of her body. She understood, perhaps more deeply than anyone else could, that the child was not merely a continuation of the family line, but a living embodiment of all its history, its obsessions, its mistakes, its secrets. She could feel its presence expanding. Within her awareness, an intelligence and consciousness that seemed to span generations. And yet, despite the terror and confusion, a small, stubborn part of her marveled at the beauty, the uniqueness, and the power of what had been born. The midwife, after hours of careful observation, finally spoke aloud the unspoken truth. This child, no one could have predicted it. It carries the past within it, yet it is entirely its own. What it will become, no one can say. But one thing is certain, nothing in this family, nothing in this estate, will ever be the same again. And, in that moment, as Eleanor held the newborn against her chest, a profound silence settled over the room. The child, no one could explain, had entered the world, a living testament to centuries of choices, obsessions, and secrets, and a force that would challenge everything the family had ever believed about life, blood, and legacy. The days following. The birth were heavy with unease. The estate, which had already held centuries of secrets in its walls, seemed to pulse with a new, unsettling energy. Eleanor's family moved through its halls like shadows, their eyes constantly drawn to the child whispering theories and fears behind closed doors. The child's existence had become a living mirror of the past, reflecting the consequences of generations of inbreeding that had been carefully hidden from the outside world. Eleanor herself was consumed by a need to understand. She began to sift through the family archives, old journals, faded letters, and brittle ledgers that documented centuries of unions, marriages, and hidden liaisons. Each page revealed another layer of obsession, another chain of decisions driven by the relentless desire to keep the bloodline pure. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and forbidden relationships were meticulously recorded, under the guise of legitimacy and necessity. Every entry whispered of secrecy, every detail hinted at the cost of their relentless pursuit of lineage. The child's traits only intensified the unease. Its features, a curious amalgamation of long-dead ancestors, were impossible to reconcile with any known pattern of heredity. Eyes that mirrored the great-grandmother who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. A faint lisp in the cry, reminiscent of a cousin who had died in infancy. A peculiar bend in the fingers that mirrored a distant uncle. All signs that the child carried within it a record of the family's past, a living archive of forbidden unions and hidden transgressions. Family gatherings became exercises in restraint. Conversations were strained, punctuated by the soft hum of anxiety that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The elders, once confident in their authority, now questioned their understanding of the family's legacy. They spoke in cryptic phrases, about patterns repeating and lines that should not cross, as if the child's very existence had illuminated connections they had never fully acknowledged. The younger generation, once indifferent, now approached the child with a mixture of fear and fascination, unsure whether to treat it as kin, anomaly, or threat. Eleanor's nights were sleepless. She could not ignore the subtle intelligence that seemed to emanate from the child, the way it responded to her voice, her touch, even her unspoken thoughts. She began to notice signs that were impossible to explain. The child seemed aware of her moods before she could articulate them. It responded to danger with instinctive precision, and it sometimes displayed physical abilities beyond its apparent age. Eleanor questioned whether she was witnessing some extraordinary adaptation, a manifestation of centuries of tightly bound genetics, or something else entirely, something that defied reason and logic. Rumors beyond the estate had also begun to stir. Villagers spoke of unusual cries in the night, glimpses of a child whose features were strange and unsettling, and the sense that the family estate itself had become a locus of uncanny events. Eleanor worried about the outside world encroaching, about whispers turning into scrutiny, and about the inevitable discovery of the family's darkest secrets. The thought of exposure, of the legacy being dissected and judged, filled her with dread, but it was eclipsed by the deeper, more pressing fear, what the child might become, and whether it would carry forward the patterns of obsession and control that had defined the family for generations. The midwife, who had been a steady presence since the birth, warned Eleanor in hushed tones one evening. "Children like this," she said, her voice trembling despite her composure, "do not merely live within a family, they become the family. They embody its history, its mistakes, and its secrets. They can heal, or they can destroy. The choice is never theirs, for the weight of what came before rests upon them from the very moment they enter the world." Eleanor absorbed the words in silence, the truth of them settling into her bones. She realized that the child's existence was not an accident. It was a reckoning, a manifestation of every choice, every hidden union, every obsession that had come before. As weeks turned into months, the family could no longer ignore the reality. The child was extraordinary, and its life would force them to confront the dark history they had long buried. Secrets were uncovered that had been thought safely hidden, letters detailing illicit unions, journals chronicling deformities and illnesses, and confessions of whispered sins that had shaped the very structure of the family. Each revelation added to the growing tension, forcing the elders to admit truths they had never spoken aloud, and challenging the younger generation to reconcile reverence with fear. The child, meanwhile, continued to grow, both in physical presence and in the aura of influence it radiated. Its intelligence, intuition, and peculiar abilities drew attention from every corner of the estate. The servants, initially fearful, became both reverent and wary. Siblings oscillated between fascination and envy, unsure whether they were witnessing a miracle or a curse. Even Eleanor's mother, whose life had been governed by the strictest adherence to tradition, began to tremble at the realization that the child embodied both the culmination of centuries of obsession and the beginning of an uncertain, uncharted future, and so the estate settled into a tense, fragile rhythm. The family, forced to confront the consequences of generations of inbreeding, moved through their days with caution and unease. Eleanor, though weary, felt a sense of purpose crystallizing within her. She understood that she alone could guide the child through this legacy, teaching it, protecting it, and perhaps even in small ways, breaking the patterns of the past. But as she gazed at the child's perceptive eyes, she knew that nothing about its life would be simple, ordinary, or predictable. The weight of generations rested upon it, and the echoes of history whispered warnings of what might come next. The child no one could explain had arrived, and with it came the inescapable truth. The family's obsession with purity and bloodline had created something extraordinary, terrifying, and uncontainable. The shadows of the past had become flesh, and the living question, that was the child, would force everyone to reckon with the consequences of secrets, sins, and unchecked obsession. The world within the estate had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. As the child grew, the estate became a realm of whispers and furtive glances, a place where silence and tension were constant companions. Eleanor, now more than ever, found herself both protector and interpreter of the extraordinary being she had brought into the world. The child's development was astonishing, each day revealing new traits that both fascinated and terrified those around it. It moved with uncanny precision, spoke in tones that seemed far beyond its age, and displayed awareness that defied simple explanation. Its presence was magnetic and unsettling, drawing attention while simultaneously inspiring fear. Isolation became inevitable. Visitors were rarely permitted, and the outside world became a distant rumor, a threatening specter that the family could neither fully ignore nor entirely confront. Eleanor's siblings and cousins, torn between love, fear, and envy, often kept their distance, unsure how to interact with a child who seemed to embody both their heritage and a disruption of it. Servants whispered of omens, refusing to approach too closely, yet compelled by an almost involuntary fascination to watch from afar. The house itself seemed to respond, creaking, shifting, and trembling in ways that mirrored the child's moods. Despite its isolation, the child began to demonstrate remarkable intelligence and insight. Eleanor noticed it could anticipate events, recognize danger, and even understand emotions in ways that startled her. It was as though the child had absorbed knowledge not only from her, but from generations of ancestors, memories and instincts encoded in its very being. Yet this awareness brought challenges. The child sometimes reacted unpredictably, displaying behaviors that were startling or even frightening. It had no peers, no ordinary context in which to learn, and no guidance beyond Eleanor's careful attention. Each day became a careful negotiation between nurturing and containment, between encouragement and caution. Outside the estate, rumors spread like wildfire. Villagers spoke of a child who was unlike any other, born under mysterious circumstances, and whose presence seemed to alter the very environment. Stories circulated of strange phenomena in the estate, objects moving, shadows shifting, strange lights at night, and a palpable aura of unease that seemed to radiate from the house itself. Some called it a miracle, others a curse, yet all felt compelled to speak of it, each tale growing more elaborate with each retelling. Eleanor, hearing snippets from servants and occasional glimpses from travelers, realized that the child's uniqueness was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. The family wrestled with these developments in private. The elders, long accustomed to control, found themselves powerless against a child whose very existence defied their authority. Every lesson in genetics, every expectation of inheritance, was rendered uncertain. The child became a mirror, reflecting not only the family's history but the flaws and obsessions that had brought them to this point. Family dinners, once casual gatherings, became tense affairs where conversations skirted the edges of the unspoken reality. A being had been born into their lineage who could not be categorized, explained, or contained. Eleanor's role became more complex as she observed the child's growing awareness of its isolation. It understood on some level that it was different, that others regarded it with awe, fear, and suspicion. She tried to shield it from judgment while teaching it the knowledge necessary to navigate a world that might never accept it, her own. Nights became sleepless, spent speaking softly to the child, guiding it, answering questions it could not yet voice, and preparing it for the inevitable moment when the wider world would demand recognition of its existence. The child's extraordinary traits made ordinary play impossible. Games and interactions that might entertain a typical child seemed insufficient. It sought challenges, puzzles, and understanding beyond its years. Eleanor recognized that its mind was developing at an accelerated pace, that it was absorbing patterns of thought, emotion, and history with a clarity that frightened her. Yet in these moments, she also saw glimpses of potential, a promise that perhaps the child could rise above the legacy of obsession and secrecy, though at what cost she could not yet know. The family, while bound to the estate, began to fracture under the weight of the child's presence. Some saw hope, a chance to redeem the lineage, to learn from centuries of mistakes and create a future that was brighter than the past. Others, consumed by fear, saw a threat, a destabilizing force that could unravel their carefully constructed world. Tensions rose. Silent battles of influence and loyalty played out behind closed doors, and Eleanor often found herself mediating not only between the child and the family, but between factions of relatives whose lives were now irrevocably intertwined with the extraordinary being she had birthed. Despite the challenges, Eleanor remained vigilant. She understood that the child's uniqueness was both a blessing and a danger, a living testament to the consequences of generations of inbreeding, secrecy, and obsession. She marveled at its abilities while fearing the inevitable questions and scrutiny the wider world would bring. In quiet moments, she wondered whether the child could ever lead a normal life, whether the estate itself could contain its presence, and whether the family could ever accept the consequences of their past actions. The estate, the family, and Eleanor herself had become part of a delicate balance, a fragile ecosystem shaped by history, genetics, and the extraordinary existence of a child no one could explain. And as the years passed, the whispers from outside grew louder, curiosity and fear intertwining into a force that would soon demand acknowledgement of what had long been hidden. The child, brilliant, strange, and unsettling, would face isolation, scrutiny, and the relentless expectations of those who both loved and feared it. Yet Eleanor, resolute in her determination, vowed to guide it, protect it, and perhaps even help it transcend the legacy of generations that had come before. Years passed, and the child grew into a being that was no longer simply extraordinary, but undeniably otherworldly. The estate, once a place of whispered secrets, had become a reflection of its presence, a living archive of history, obsession, and inevitability. Eleanor, now older and tempered by the years of vigilance and care, watched as the child navigated a world both within and beyond the estate walls. It had learned to read the hidden currents of family politics, to anticipate the moods of those around it, and to wield its intelligence and awareness with subtle precision. But with every triumph, there was a reminder of the legacy it carried. Generations of secrecy, obsession, and inbreeding, woven into its very being. The family, once confident in its control over lineage and destiny, had fractured under the weight of this extraordinary child. Some embraced it as a chance to correct past mistakes, to witness the culmination of their bloodline in a form that defied expectation. Others recoiled, fearful that its presence was a harbinger of doom, a living testament to centuries of unchecked obsession. Arguments became sharper, alliances shifted, and the quiet halls of the estate were once again alive with tension, though now it was measured, strategic, and far more dangerous than the fear of the early days. The child's understanding of the world continued to deepen, its mind a complex tapestry of ancestral knowledge, instinct, and original thought. It displayed abilities that bordered on the uncanny, an awareness of hidden dangers, an empathy that pierced pretense, and a capacity for learning that seemed limitless. Yet alongside these gifts were challenges, moments of isolation, confusion, and the ever-present question of identity. It could sense the fear, envy, and awe directed at it, and it wrestled with the weight of expectations it had inherited from a family obsessed with lineage and purity. Eleanor realized that no amount of guidance could fully shield the child from the consequences of its origins. The outside world, once kept at a careful distance, began to encroach, drawn by rumors of the strange phenomena surrounding the estate and the impossible nature of the child. Curiosity turned to scrutiny, fascination into speculation, and the delicate equilibrium maintained within the household began to strain under the pressure. Eleanor knew that one day the child would face judgment not just from the family but from society itself, a society unprepared for a being born from centuries of secrecy, inbreeding, and obsession. The child, for its part, adapted with a resilience that both reassured and frightened Eleanor. It moved through the world with a quiet confidence, an understanding of its own uniqueness that seemed to bypass the usual developmental struggles of childhood. Yet Eleanor could see the shadows within it, the traces of ancestral mistakes, the lingering echoes of generations of obsession, and the inescapable weight of family history. It was both brilliant and burdened, a living paradox that could inspire reverence or terror depending on the observer. As the years continued, the family's reckoning became unavoidable. Hidden documents, forbidden letters, and records of centuries-old unions were uncovered, exposing the full extent of the bloodline's history. The village beyond the estate, once a distant source of rumors, began to question and challenge the family, demanding explanations that the elders could no longer avoid. Eleanor, ever vigilant, understood that the child would need to confront these forces on its own terms, to navigate the treacherous intersection of family legacy, societal expectation, and its own extraordinary abilities. In quiet moments, Eleanor reflected on the journey from the child's conception to this point, the impossible pregnancy, the birth that defied understanding, the unrelenting scrutiny of the household and village, and the growing awareness of the child's own power. She realized that the child had become more than a continuation of the bloodline. It was a reckoning, a living testament to the consequences of obsession, secrecy, and the relentless pursuit of purity. It embodied both the brilliance and the darkness of those who had come before, a bridge between history and the uncertain future. The child, now older and increasingly self-aware, stood at the center of the estate, a presence that could not be ignored. It had learned to navigate the fears, expectations, and ambitions of those around it, transforming potential threats into cautious alliances and mistrust into respect. Eleanor watched, knowing that the legacy of the family, its obsessions, mistakes, and secrets, would now unfold through this extraordinary being. The child's life was no longer dictated by the past alone. It would shape the future, for better or worse, carrying with it the echoes of generations that could never be erased. And in the stillness of the estate, where centuries of whispered secrets and hidden sins had once held dominion, the child moved with quiet purpose. It was a living question, a paradox of blood and history, and the embodiment of everything the family had tried to contain. Eleanor understood that its journey was just beginning, that the world beyond the estate would soon bear witness to what no one could explain, and that the child, born from generations of inbreeding and secrecy, would forever alter the course of the family's story. The legacy, both cursed and extraordinary, had found its living embodiment. And with the child standing at the intersection of past and future, nothing would ever be the same again.